Hello, friends. Brian with City of the Immaculata back with you. I am joined today by Jared Selim. He is a convert, interestingly enough, from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints to Catholicism. Jared has told his conversion story, I believe, at least once, if not two or three places that you could find. I would direct you guys to go and listen to that conversion story. It's always very fascinating to hear how our brothers and sister Catholics converts become Catholic, and the LDS to Catholic pipeline is not a typical one. So I direct people to go find those interviews with Jared. Jared's joining me today. I thought we would do something a little bit different. We are going to touch upon some areas, I think, of the Mormon Catholic dialogue, historical, theological. We have several different areas to touch upon today that I don't see as addressed as often. And I thought Jared would be a good guest to have on to discuss these issues. So, Jared, hello.
Hello, Brian. It's good to be on the show. I'll introduce myself very briefly, and then we can get into some of the topic questions that we had discussed previously. So I'm a convert from Mormonism. I was a Utah Mormon, born and raised in that area, born in Sandy, Utah. All of my friends growing up were Latter-day Saints. I remained very religiously active in the LDS Church up through my 18th year, and so I was, particularly in my teenage years, I did a lots of study, lots of prayer, all the things that would be characteristic of your Latter-day Saint family in that day. I started investigating Latter-day Saint history and Catholic theology and history about that time. So this would be when I was 16, 17 years old. And throughout the process of several years, I eventually concluded that Mormonism was not tenable, even on its own terms. I think that's something that's very important to keep in check. We want to make sure that we are listening to Latter-day Saints and making sure that we're operating not on what our prejudices are about the LDS Church, but actually addressing and navigating through their own sets of claims. And this is something that G.K. Chesterton, the Catholic author, recommended very strongly back in his day. And I did the same thing with the Catholic Church, making sure it was doing things on its own terms. I also investigated Eastern Orthodoxy a little while. But particularly during that period, I was very much struck by not necessarily, and yes, the lack of dialogue that I've seen between Mormons and more traditional Christian groups, excluding some evangelical Protestant circles, where most of the religious or anti-Mormon material comes from. That's not so much the case with Catholics. And I actually think that's a benefit to us because as we're coming through from a place where we're not as well established in the ring, so we can make our different name for ourselves and has been historically made. And I think there's an opportunity for growth there. So that's a little bit about myself. One thing I will mention about my conversion journey that will be very different from the majority of Latter-day Saints who leave the LDS Church is that people tend to focus on very historical details, things that you would find as not necessarily they're the core of Mormonism, but they're more fringe or idiosyncratic features. So, for example, the Book of Abraham, Joseph Smith's practice of polygamy or Freemasonry. These things tend not to be centrally focused on, even in today's Latter-day Saint culture, but they are important. And what causes people to leave for these reasons is something I'd like to discuss more with you, but also possibly entertain a perhaps more effective, more faith-filled, and positive vision for dialogue, a more positive vision for evangelization that we haven't necessarily seen in the last few decades of Catholic apologetics in Mormon dialogue.
Yeah, well, this is going to be an interesting one for me because it's going to test some of my ability, my retention rates, because it's been many years actually since I have studied Mormonism in depth. But I did actually go through a deep dive into it. And I think, objectively, I walked away with a greater appreciation for it than I had to begin with.
Mm.
I can appreciate what you're talking about with this opportunity here that presents itself, kind of in like a unique place and time with the growth and dialogue. Because I will say one of the things, and I forget how I even ended up in this kind of rabbit hole, is I ended up studying quite a bit of the ex-Mormon culture, which I know you and I said we would touch upon a little bit tonight. But I'll just, by way of introduction to that, I will say, in the forums that I was engaging with back then, there was almost a unique respect where I didn't necessarily, and maybe this is just my, this is anecdotal, but I didn't necessarily see it so much with how, especially how ex-Mormons approach their attitude towards the LDS Church and hierarchy. But when Catholicism was brought up in these forums, there was a respectful attitude that I was kind of, even from like an ex-Mormon population, that I was kind of interested in, and I was like, well, it would be an interesting thing to tap into. I never really spent the time doing so. But I will say, like I said, with the history, at one time I had a stack of books. It's kind of humorous. When I was, goes back to the beginning of my marriage. When I first married my wife, we had, those periods where you're getting to know each other, right? And there was at one time I was super like just absorbed in Islamic history and theology, and I had this stack of books on my nightstand. And after like days and weeks of this, my wife was like, "We're not converting to Islam, right? Like that's." And then like months later, the next thing was the LDS Church, and I had this stack of books on LDS, and she was like, "We're not converting to LDS, are we? Like we're not becoming Mormon, are we?" So yeah, no, I spent quite a bit of time in that, and I will say, to put that kind of positive spin on it, like you were saying, that I think there is an opportunity here, and I think the mistake would be for Catholics to approach the LDS the way that you would typically see them approach like a fundamentalist Protestant. I don't think it's actually, and I don't know your opinions on this, I don't think it's correct to lump the LDS in with mainstream Protestantism at large. And I think there is a clear distinctions that would sort of separate those two groups from one another. And I would also say, even just dealing with it from an apologetics realm, you're dealing with something very different. And Mormonism has really kind of undergone, maybe in the last 20 years, a major shift in its apologetical approach. You don't see, the era of, Hugh Nibley and that sort of forceful, assured apologetics. It's kind of given way to, the apologetics of Farm and Fair, which are a little bit more cautious and reserved in their approach to dealing with the sort of questions and conundrums of Mormon history and theology. And it's actually a little bit more subtle in many ways as well. So I would say Catholics would be wrong to take a sort of historic approach, as you were discussing.
Right.
And I'm interested in your idea, too, of approaching the Mormon question from a more, your suggestion was to approach it from a more internal critique,
This is
as
correct.
opposed to the historical critical method. So if you'd like to talk about that a little bit.
So I want to address that a second. So let's describe a little bit of the difference between the restorationist movement of Mormonism and Protestantism, particularly in its evangelical or low church expressions. Mormonism, yes, while it has its historical roots in a lot of Protestant theology and ideas about how the church was later, how later in Mormonism the church dissolves. When we refer to the Great Apostasy, we're referring to a period in which the church itself completely vaporized. When you hear ancient church in Mormonism, it's a very hypothetical reality that's tethered to the internal doctrines of Mormonism. You're not pointing to the church fathers, for example. The New Testament is often regarded as a corrupt work, corrupted by translation errors or outright redaction, that sort of thing. And so with Mormonism, there's a much more dramatic separation, much more overt separation between history, historical Christianity, tradition, the magisterium, the emergence of the biblical corpus, from as it is in Protestantism, whether that's High Church Anglicanism or your local Baptist church. There's very little, there's no sense, and in some ways there's enough of a antagonism or a separation from that historical perspective that you can't lump it in with these other categories. And that's largely because of its attitude towards tradition, history, and scripture. Those are the main three things that I would recommend as a distinguishing point from Protestants and Mormons. So in fact, I will be honest here, Mormons and Muslims hate being compared to each other. But the point in which you have to recognize a fundamental parallel is their historical theology and the way that the self-contained dogma that they have. So Islam begins, 5th, 6th century with Muhammad, with the belief that all the previous revelations of Allah were corrupted. Very similar narrative you see in Mormonism, but with both of those traditions, the notion that there's this isolation from the past forms this little bubble of dogma. And so you actually have, not starting from the ancient church, starting from Joseph Smith, you move forward, and there's this whole system of canon and doctrine that isn't necessarily accountable to historical Christianity or scripture, as Protestants and Catholics both recognize. Now, how this comes into play with my preferred method of engaging with Latter-day Saint theology, critiquing it, examining it, seeing where its strengths are, where its weaknesses are. An internal critique requires you to navigate Mormonism on its own terms. The Catholic author, G.K. Chesterton, as I've mentioned before, he observed in a lot of his time a very vulgar prejudice of people who would be antagonistic towards Mormonism for the sake of some foreign, very frantic feature that they perceive, such as polygamy, and they wouldn't really go into a dialogue with Latter-day Saints about why Brigham Young and Joseph Smith and up to Wilford Woodruff and his successors, why would they have gone through with polygamy in the way they did? So there's this caricature that we have of Mormonism, and that's not just a historical caricature, it's a theological caricature. And what I mean by that is that we're not getting really deep into the way the system works. We're not thinking about, okay, even though we may disagree with Mormons about the nature of God, Mormons assume that God, what is, and man are equivalent ontologically, with God being a more exalted, evolved, or matured being of the same species. We don't ever engage with the internal implications. We don't ever engage with, okay, how does this reverberate through Latter-day Saint scripture and the Bible as it was translated by Joseph Smith? There's a lot of superimposing our own systems of thought onto this very self-contained system. And in a lot of times, what people will do when they resort to the historical critical method, they will resort to I have a naturalistic explanation for something versus a divine inspiration explanation for, say, the Book of Mormon or the Book of Abraham. They will find evidence that supports the idea of a 19th century origin for the Latter-day Saint scriptures, anachronisms, contradictions, grammar errors. They will go through these things that will justifiably produce suspicion, but you'll very rarely have a point where they're actually arguing from our positive necessity that the Book of Mormon was not a 19th century work. They're often arguing from, say, these parallelisms provide a simpler explanation for what we're observing in Mormonism. So they're really not engaging at all with the theology. They're not engaging with the presuppositions that require the Book of Mormon to be true, for the prophet to be speaking out of divine inspiration instead of his own opinions. There's a lot. All of these questions are not investigated in most apologetic discussions with Latter-day Saints, and it's a pity. But what I would want to encourage in my own apologetic work is more attention, more direct interaction, more challenge and thoughtfulness directed at the thing that Latter-day Saints hold devotion and obligation to. So, for example, I'll use a popular example with that I often refer to. So, Latter-day Saints do have a firm conviction of the traditional Christian morality as expressed in the New Testament. That's very conventional Christian morals, as expressed in the commandments. Now, this is exemplified this is both exemplified and contradicted in Latter-day Saint scripture, and in the writings of prophets who elaborated this in a more systematic way. So the Latter-day Saints, when they talk about commandments, usually those commandments are supposed to be followed, but there will be specific historical incidences where that does not apply. So, for example, the disobedience of Adam and Eve in partaking the forbidden fruit. That in Mormonism is viewed as morally imperative. And this produces a set of questions that even Latter-day Saints themselves really don't grapple with often. So, for example, 1 Nephi chapter 3, verse 7, it says, Nephi speaking, so this is a Book of Mormon prophet figure. I will go and do the things that the Lord has commanded, for I know he will provide a way for me to do the things which he has accomplished, because he does not, wait a minute, the Lord does not give a commandment unto the children of men, save he should provide a way for them to accomplish the thing he had commanded. This particular verse comes in conflict with this idea that Latter-day Saints hold, that the two first commandments, do not eat of the tree of the knowledge and multiply and replenish the earth, are mutually exclusive. They're contradictory. You can't keep both at the same time. That's the way that Latter-day Saints view the fall and the motivation for progress into mortality from the Garden of Eden. So when you have these internal contradictions, you're faced with questions of, which commandments am I supposed to trust that God gives? Or do I just refer to my own interior wisdom? Can I trust that? Is it just Adam and Eve, or are there other occasions when it's appropriate to directly disobey divine law? It turns out there are other occasions when Joseph Smith and Brigham Young and up to Wilford Woodruff did engage in that sort of behavior, where they would have a divine revelation that was firmly held, such as the 1890 manifesto preventing polygamy. We have evidence that was collected by a scholar named D. Michael Quinn about how polygamy was practiced from 1890 up to 1904. This created a very scandalous episode where the Latter-day Saint leaders said they would stop under the premise of divine authority, divine law, and they would lie in order to keep practicing polygamy. This is very, very well documented. And they didn't actually stop this until the Reed-Smoot hearings in 1904. And even then, there was a hesitancy to discipline those who were still actively polygamous up until the 1930s.
Is this a part of lying for the Lord?
Right, exactly.
Concept? Yeah.
It is a lying for the Lord concept, where there's a very, very overt contradiction of commandments. And when you're introduced to this historical concept, you really can't tell whether there is such a thing as objective moral truth that is discernible within the divine revelation. And so this kind of approach is the kind of thing that I would have taken. I tried very hard to harmonize things as a Latter-day Saint, to treat things in good faith. And there was occasions like that where I found that I concluded not from suspicion, but from positive necessity of the contrary, that this integral belief to Mormonism compromise the very thing that Latter-day Saints have a devotion to, which is the commandments of God.
Yeah, I think it's something that Catholics in particular, need to be careful about when they, um, whichever approach they're going to take. Even with the idea of an internal critique, because many of the things that the LDS are accused of for being, strange, or
Mm-hmm.
what other kind of criticisms? Well, the strangeness one, for example, like that's kind of a difficult one for Catholics to lob at anybody, because you yourself as a convert, I myself as a convert, sometimes those that have been lifelong Catholics don't see just how strange Catholicism
Yeah,
really is.
endearingly
It's
so, but
yeah,
yes.
yeah, yeah. So, the idea of like certain things that you might hear about with the Mormons. I know, historical, like polygamy was one that came up a lot, but even something as, like modern and simple as the undergarments that Mormons would wear.
Right.
In one area that I think that maybe Catholics need to be particularly careful about is in undermining the sort of ecclesial structure of the LDS Church. Because I will actually hand it to Joseph Smith. Now, whether I have a tendency to think this is probably a little bit more fortuitous than providential. I think he maybe was an astute enough man to sort of realize the problem here. But I think actually one of the real problems with historical Protestantism is that they can't agree on when the church actually became corrupt, to what degree they would say that happened. There's no consensus on that. And I think it's actually a little bit more, in terms of an internal critique, consistent to hold to the theory of an apostasy, a great apostasy,
Right.
and that there needs to be a restoration. I actually think this is, now, while it's historically maybe absurd once you start deep diving into it, as far as like an internal critique goes, I think that's actually a more consistent approach to hold. And then beyond that, Smith was able, I think, to see that there needs to be, in order for there to be a restoration, there needs to actually be a church authority, an authoritative body to say, okay, this is the church now, this is the visible
Right.
church. So, I know in terms of what we had discussed about before, with how Catholics that are doing, maybe for the first time, they're going to be engaged in these subjects, um, interacting with the whole idea of ecclesial authority in Mormonism, maybe in contradistinction to Catholicism, but there also might be, I would say, areas where Catholics would need to navigate this unless they saw off the branch that we sit on, right?
Right.
Because
Right.
while we do have, I think, more historical credibility given back to the apostolic succession and these things that we can verify, in terms of some kind of epistemological justification for the Catholic Church, the idea of authority in ecclesial body, I think, is actually a important distinction that the Mormons make. I don't know what your thoughts on this are.
Joseph Smith, June 16th, 1844, said, "The Catholic traditions are worth more than all you have said." Talking to the Protestants.
Hmm.
And for this very reason you're describing, if a branch separates itself from the trunk and proclaims itself to be the good tree, in spite of the fact that it came from a bad root, then you are faced with a challenge of where does your own legitimacy come from? You're undermined the very principle of authority. Now, I think Joseph Smith was right there in a very compartmentalized way. He actually used a lot of the same tactics that Protestants used at the time in order to establish fixated exclusive authority. For example, John Calvin's secret testimony of the Holy Spirit, private revelation. John Calvin was very similar to Joseph Smith. He spoke like a prophet, believed in apostolic ordination. Earlier in Joseph Smith's career, he held to a more charismatic sense of ordained priesthood authority with the imposition of hands. John Calvin is very similar. with the Latter-day Saint ecclesiology, I would want to mention two things. One, where does their authority claim come from, including where does the great how do they justify themselves against the great apostasy? Two, have they been canonically consistent in the way they define authority? And let's go to the great apostasy question for just a second. Most people, including Latter-day Saints, make the mistake of assuming that when a Mormon says great apostasy, they mean doctrinal accretions. Okay, that's not what Mormonism says. It is not what the Book of Mormon says, or Joseph Smith any other occasions. Mormonism is founded on this idea that the exclusive hierarchy of Mormonism has authoritative continuing revelation from heaven in a way that is distinct from any other charismatic sect. And the reason why the ancient church fell is because they lost the continuing revelation. Okay, this is something that Albert Cowdery in an 1834 letter that he wrote. I believe it's contained in the Pearl of Great Price, where he describes the point of continuing revelation as the basis for the authority of the church. How did the ancient church, according to Latter-day Saints, in Scripture and prophetic teachings, happen? The Book of Mormon does not point to doctrinal accretion so much. Maybe in one place it does, although it would I believe this is in 3rd Nephi. It says that if you do not hold to the first, if you add or subtract from the first principles of the gospel, baptism, faith, repentance, baptism, and I believe confirmation. If you do not hold strictly to those principles, the gates of hell will prevail against you. That's sort of the language that 3rd Nephi uses. But almost every other occasion, the concept of the gates of hell will not prevail against you. It means the same thing for Mormons as it does for Catholics. It is a claim of indefectibility. It refers to indefectibility conditional on not being wicked and unbelieving. This is the reason why the Book of Mormon says that the ancient church in America, the primitive church of America, when Christ visited the Americas, for those who don't know, Nephites, Lamanites, these civilizational groups described in the Book of Mormon that had migrated over from Israel during the just before the Babylonian captivity. Christ is believed to have come to the Americas and established a separate apostolic college there with 12 disciples. And how did that group fall away from Christ? Wickedness, unbelief. Those are the words that they were used. Now, here's the problem with Latter-day Saint doctrine on that point. It requires a total apostasy. Okay, that means that you have to have an absolute defection of all the priesthood authority from both the doctrine and from moral life. Okay, because by the way, there's something in a Doctrine and Covenants section 121 that refers to the power and authority of heaven being conditional on moral living, and that amen to the authority of that man if should he depart from said given descriptions of a moral life. And this all harmonizes, this all reverberates within Mormonism to present this idea that the ancient church fell away while the current church, the Latter-day Saint church, is maintained by the moral worthiness of its priesthood offices. Now, here's the problem with that. In the Book of Mormon and in Doctrine and Covenants, there's this idea of the 3 Nephites and John the Revelator, or John the Apostle, or St. John the Apostle, as we would call him. These 4 figures asked Christ in Mormonism for an immortal life in order to spread the gospel. Okay. We know from the Book of Mormon that these 3 Nephites were around for centuries. Okay. We can only infer that John the Apostle was on a similar track. The reason why when Joseph Smith was producing the Book of Mormon, The 3 Nephites were removed. Why? Wickedness and unbelief. These were the last priesthood authority. These are some of the last priesthood, immortal priesthood authority figures. You would think a great apostasy was impossible if these guys stayed around, which is very strange. And you can only infer that John the Revelator was removed for similar reasons in the old world. And so when you have this tension of this moral authority claim, in this sense of moral worthiness, with the ancient church and the new church, even Joseph Smith, towards the end of his life, he says, I boast that I have done something that Christ has never done. I have held the church together, and the Latter-day Saints have not fallen away from me yet. He's very clear that it's not a sort of divine, an unconditional divine protection. He's referring to the morality of the saints, of the Latter-day Saints, as the basis for the indefectibility and legitimacy of the Latter-day Saint Church. You would be hard-pressed to find evidence that Latter-day Saints in the 19th century, I'm not making the case that all Latter-day Saints today are immoral. You would be hard-pressed to find a case that there was not that the apostles and the priesthood leaders at that time were conducting themselves in a way sufficiently moral, according to Latter-day Saint scripture, to be worthy of the priesthood. And so you have that, and you have this other, you do have another additional problem, which is a little bit is separate.
Well, can I ask you before you go to that?
Yeah, go ahead. Let's go ahead and stop here. I think this is a good thing to hover around.
So with the idea of, and I know like sometimes with Joseph Smith, it's not actually dissimilar to Luther, where you're like, okay, what point of his life are we talking about here? Because sometimes it's like follow the bouncing ball. But I know you were saying at a certain point there's like a certain similarity between his idea of the church and ecclesial structure and Calvin. But I know that Calvin was also very this is related to the Protestant Reformation in general, but they were also very insistent on the idea of the church invisible, whereas Catholics have always been, the one of the main critiques of Protestantism is, where is the visible church then? And it seems like, and maybe again this might have been something that Smith himself, I assumed it was something he was conscious of as he was doing, but it seemed like he realized that, there needs to be, this is the church, thus saith the Lord, this is where the authority begins and ends. So it seems like he really has a good idea of the necessity of a church visible for people to point to, right? Like that is the church that we should be. Whereas, with Calvin and with Luther and the Protestant Reformation in general, it's what's in your heart, it's the interior. And I guess as far as an internal critique would go, the challenge therefore for Smith would be that, like, for example, in Hebrews, we get the idea of the Melchizedek priesthood being in perpetuity through time.
Right.
But that's sort of separate. But anyways, the idea of the church visible seems to have been something that Smith, at least subconsciously, was aware of.
There's two things I'd like to say to you. You are right that the Latter-day Saint Church has its very extrinsic framework of authority. There's a very visible hierarchy. But here's the problem. It also has the issue of invisible interior witness, the invisible interior testimony, the inward burning into the bosom. And here's why that comes up as a problem. Latter-day Saint theology has shifted so much from its origin that you will have this recency bias. Let's listen to the contemporary prophets over any prophet that's died, pretty much. Even you'll hear from Bruce R. McConkie. He says, "Forget everything I have said or any other prophet has said that contradicts the present revelation." This is something he said about the 1970s, and the point of that, Wilford Woodruff said very similar things, by the way. Said that, quoting Brigham Young in an anecdote, he says, "Oh yeah, the scriptures are worthless compared to the prophets." You have this exoskeleton of authority. It looks very polished, it looks neat, it looks bureaucratic, but there's not a lot of accountability to that authority because of this recency bias, because of a lot of these arbitrary shifts. The thing that the hinge point for me withdrawing my assent to Mormonism was the removal of the lectures on faith and replacing it with a incompatible theology on God and the Holy Spirit. That was the thing that knocked me out. And I just couldn't for the life of me. If Joseph Smith was so insistent on having a visible authority that you can turn to, and then without any clear direction, no rubric for deciding when he speaks as a prophet or when he doesn't, he shifted his position numerous times. And Brigham Young, when he was further developing the Latter-day Saint scripture canon, he changed some things that Smith said to their opposite meaning. If you go to Doctrine and Covenants, section 130, verse 22, and you search up its textual development online, a guy named Robert Bartholomew did this. He measures out how the text itself actually changed. And Joseph Smith revised scriptural texts all the time, inverted their meaning, added anachronisms to support his authority structure. It's so fluid. It's Mormon. In the words of a guy named Brian Birch, he is a Latter-day Saint scholar. He says Mormonism is a theological free agent, and it's in some ways the problem of fluidity, of constantly changing doctrine, not being able to settle down on a specific thing, actually intensifies in Mormonism even more than it does in a lot of Protestant groups.
Yeah, I think it's, if that's more the case, then you are really dealing with a internal contradiction. Now, that's not to say that, in the Catholic Church, there is a sense in which there's an internal conversion that happens, right?
Right.
It's not to deny that, but the idea of the church visible is an integral mark of the true church as far as Catholics are concerned. So yeah, it sounds like Smith in a way is trying to hold two disparate threads together there.
Correct.
I had actually never tied it into the whole concept of the burning in the bosom, and
yeah, a lot of
that.
Let me stop you, dear, just for a moment. The burning in the bosom. This is, as a personal note, this was probably the thing that separated me, alienated me from a lot of Latter-day Saints. I love them very much. I would frequently run into this problem where I would note a internal contradiction, or I would note some issue in the canon, or some claim, some very basic claim, and I would very often have a Sunday school answer response, something that was a platitude, or saying, "Oh, we're just going to put that on the shelf." Very few people actually wanted to engage with me, and, really deepen their systematic understanding. How do we perceive the coherence of our religion? Because reason is something that Latter-day Saints profess just as much. They might, now in practice, they might be compartmentalized a little, but the obligation to hold to the true faith, to be able to obey the commandments of God, that's where the whole fall of Adam and Eve thing comes into play. If you're unable to accomplish these basic steps, I found myself struggling to help, not necessarily to help others, but to really participate in the community in a way where such contradictions were accepted on the basis of, oh, we're not really a philosophical church. I got a lot of that kind of response. It's unfortunate.
Yeah, and that's also too, I think it plays into a little bit of that shift. You've alluded to it a couple times, and I think it's maybe an important distinction to make. My time researching this stuff has mainly been spent in the life of Smith, and then a little bit into the life of the era of Brigham Young.
Right.
And like, just for example, I know with Brigham Young, he started off a charismatic, and even with his introduction into the LDS Church and his working his way up through the hierarchy of the church, he was very interested still in the charismatic experience,
Right.
speaking in tongues, prophesying. All of these things were in that very early period, especially like in Missouri, an integral part of what it was to be a Mormon, an LDS. And then, there's a shift to at a certain point, and this could be maybe, I know this was something that you had brought up in our notes. There's a certain introduction, I would say, and this could be possibly through the introduction of some of the Masonic elements,
Okay. Yes. Correct.
and as well, I think just sheer attrition through some of the political pressures that are taking place with the LDS Church in I'm saying it is Missouri, right? That's where they were at.
Yes.
It's not,
Missouri or Kirtland, Ohio. Okay.
yeah.
So let's stop here. Let's give a little bit of a timeline
Mhm.
here. So Joseph Smith starts a church in 1830. He claims to have received an ordination by the laying on of hands from John the Baptist, Peter, James, and John in 1829. There is very little historical evidence in favor of that. In fact, even the Latter-day Saint scholar Richard Bushman admits to the possibility of fabrication
Mhm.
of those historical accounts. If you go to a man by the name of Dan Vogel, probably one of the preeminent historians on Mormonism, he's ex-Mormon now. He describes how the not the ecclesiology of the priesthood in Mormonism evolved. You go evolution of Mormon priesthood authority. That's the name of the two lectures. Mormonism was initially much more charismatic. The sheer presence of a revelation, such as a commandment to start a church, was itself enough jurisdictional authority to begin completing that work.
Mhm.
So a person could start ordaining someone immediately after. This is the way that if you go to the book of Mosiah in the Book of Mormon, Alma the elder, he receives a revelation. He goes out into the wilderness and starts baptizing people. No real evidence that he received baptism, the authority to baptize, as it's required by Latter-day Saints. There's a little anachronism from later understanding of authority there. I don't believe it's possible for the current, more formal priesthood authority structure with apostolic succession in Mormonism to hold up. Primarily for the reasons that are noted in Dan Vogel's lectures. I have privately searched down most of the sources that he used and found them to be reliable. More towards 1834, 1835, you have this introduced idea of a more formal hierarchy structure that comes in, partly inspired by Freemasonry, but more so by political pressures. This is a moment of crisis for the LDS Church in which Joseph Smith could no longer rely on this goes back to 1831. Joseph Smith became the president of the church about 1831. This is still an anachronism, but it's not as severe as probably I think some others make it out to be. The 12 apostles are introduced in 1835. Okay, that's important detail. So this is right around the dedication of the Kirtland Temple for those Latter-day Saints who are watching. From here on, you get this idea that the apostleship and the first presidency that was established earlier are these equal offices. I don't remember which section of the Doctrine and Covenants is. It says that they're equal in authority. The first presidency is equal in authority to the 12, and the quorum of the 70 is equal in authority to everything's equal in authority to each other. What happens? The reason why Brigham Young picks up the slack after Joseph Smith's death, his murder at Carthage jail. So the Latter-day Saints started splitting off in groups. Sidney Rigdon was one. Emma Smith and his son and her son, Joseph Smith III, was one. And the 12 apostles were the other. Brigham Young never claimed to be the president of the church. This is more Sidney Rigdon's line of thinking, being the second counselor in the first presidency. What Brigham Young did is that he made an arbitrary doctrinal claim that said that the 12 apostles had the authority to establish a new president. And for some reason, he had a lot of charismatic prowess above Sidney Rigdon. There were some very late claims that there were like a theophanic experience where
Hmm.
Brigham Young was transfigured into Joseph Smith. Those are not reliable accounts. I've looked through them, and it's from this perspective that the 12 apostles themselves all participating in the inner ring of polygamy, and most of them being Freemasons. Okay, so that's part of the word you got this this united combination of people sharing interests. They carry forward with the dominant strain of the LDS Church that has become, not without a great many other schisms, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints as it is today. It's it's a bit of a historical accident that the First Presidency and the Quorum of the 12 are as they are today. There's nothing really essential distinguishing, say, the LDS Church, the mainstream Mormonism, from the reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. This would be Emma Hale Smith and Joseph Smith III's transition. By the way, you mentioned Brigham Young. He had a developing theological framework as well. A lot of the theological opinions that Brigham Young had that are now rejected by Latter-day Saints, even the LDS, I remember an apologist apostle from our LDS church saying that this was grounded enough to show that Brigham Young was not divinely inspired. And probably you get into the same issue that I talked about before. There really is no rubric to
Hmm.
find other than accident of history for why one thing is rejected while another is accepted.
Yeah, I think that's the sort of the key. Now, I've read Fawn Brody. I've
Yeah,
read Grant Palmer's biography of Smith, and Bushman's, I think, is sort of in my opinion, kind of the essential biography of
yeah,
Smith.
that's great. I
Um,
agree.
and that's actually the one that I recommend to people for the simple fact that Bushman is sympathetic to Smith,
Right.
even as I think as close, because Bushman himself being I think he's still LDS. He
Yes, he's
was as
still yes.
at the time of writing the book, certainly. And it's as close as a objective historian as a Mormon, I think, can get. Where you do get the sense with Smith in many ways that it's a little bit anarchic,
Yeah,
and he's introduced to something sort of fortuitously, and okay, I'm gonna cherry pick from this, and we're gonna throw a little bit of that in there, when he's sort of making this like stew. And then meanwhile there's all these political pressures that are taking place, which, granted, I think I don't think in the LDS history, the hagiographic history of Smith, I don't think the LDS are particularly objective in the role that they played towards some of those pressures that were placed upon
right.
them. But at the same time, some of those pressures were quite excessive, and they did produce crisis for the LDS at many times, where the LDS were just simply, I think, reacting. For example,
Right.
when is it William Law, when he left the church and he puts out his Nauvoo Expositor, I
Yep.
believe,
Yep.
challenging my history here. But,
Mhm.
and then, so that is sort of the impetus, like they're already there's the is it governor's
Yep.
what is it called, his extermination order,
And
right, for
Governor
the
Boggs. Yep.
got
Governor Boggs' termination order. Yep.
right. So the Mormons are sort of faced with this existential crisis of this extermination order, and they have an internal problem where one of their own, William Law, who's actually, I think, in many ways a respected man,
I think I
turns
think
on
he was an
Smith.
LDS apostle as well.
He was, and so to have him turn on Smith and write this expose, if you will, which in many ways I think people that are interested in this should actually go back and read William
Oh yeah.
Law's expositor, read what
Read
he's
that first and
saying.
only issue.
Yes, read it, because then what they do is, as a sort of reactionary thing that's happening, they smash his printing press, and this becomes the sort of snowball effect towards
Right.
Joseph
That was
Smith's.
the catalyst leading
Yep.
to Smith's murder.
And then there's this existential crisis again, where it's like you could see they were thoroughly not prepared for Smith to be murdered at this point.
Right.
And that's, yeah, I mean, again, once you see, and I actually do, in some ways, I will say for both of them, and I'm always careful with my words here. So you guys, if you're going to quote me, make sure you quote me accurately. But I would say that both Smith and Young were both great men. Now,
Yeah.
I include a lot of people in the category of great men that I don't necessarily um, aspire to. I
I
don't
understand.
necessarily think are right, but Young, I think you have to admire, even while acknowledging his flaws and his serious errors. Was like the one that was able to sort of, if you put yourself in the shoes of somebody that would have been how anarchic and insane it would have been at that time, to move these people from Western Missouri to basically they're heading out to what's literally the frontier, because the area of Utah, one, they didn't know they were going to head to Utah. They were just sort of heading out into the, like, wherever we go, we trust in you, Young, to tell us where to go and when to stop and where to plan and so for him to be able to sort of hold all of that together, I think is an incredible feat. But it also, I
Yeah.
think, plays into the fact that it was um, Mormonism in those early days, I think, was born out of a lot of crisis that I don't think is necessarily.
Mhm.
Now you could, and I'm sure
And
as
and,
a,
and, and, and we don't mean that in a sense necessary, not so much in a, perhaps that's a criticism in a way, but it's also a sense of sympathy. I
well, I
don't
was
think,
actually, I was just
yeah,
going to say, I think for a true believing Mormon, the hagiographic way that they would look on that was like, we were born out of persecution and
right.
prejudice, and yeah, exactly.
Even Bishop Dwayne Hunt, in his defense of Catholicism against some of the polemics that uh, Latter-day Saints like Bruce R. McConkie were throwing at the Catholic Church, he notes, yep, we understand. We've been Catholics have been persecuted more, probably because they've been around for longer, but we do
Mhm.
understand the sense that the tumultuous birth of this movement.
Mhm. Yeah, so no, that was just my way of saying that I think you're absolutely right that a lot of these things seem, and like I said, and I'm by far no expert, seem to have been born of crisis, and that's, I think in some ways, and you could easily make this criticism, I guess, of any religion, but in some ways the justification for the theology that is born of the crisis is almost an afterthought, right? Like, we're looking back and attempting to justify, for example, polygamy, where,
Yeah, okay, I want to stop there just for a
yeah.
second. So one of the things that I mentioned this before, some of the reasons that polygamy is so controversial is because of the deception that was involved in its practice, both with Joseph Smith and with Wilford Woodruff going up to 1904.
Would you,
There's
well, for the audience that doesn't know, would you explain this? Because my understanding is that traditional Mormon apologetics was that polygamy was a Utah
correct.
innovation, not a Nauvoo innovation. So could you
Okay.
explain that for people that don't know?
Traditional Latter-day Saint apologetics, yes. So there was, I don't remember the name of the people that did it, but someone wrote a thesis defending the idea that Brigham Young was the one that started polygamy, not Smith.
Mhm.
Okay, that is historically rejected. We have contemporaneous first-hand accounts from Joseph Smith himself and others. They're available on Joseph Smith papers detailing the evidence, suggesting that either Smith is involved in sexual affairs or that he was developing his theology. There's really, really good firsthand sources on this. That's not disputed anymore in contemporary Latter-day Saint apologetics. But with polygamy, yeah, this is something that the Catholic convert from Mormonism, Jeremy Christiansen, he makes a genetic fallacy. A lot of Latter-day Saints, polygamy is the first manifestation of what they call celestial or eternal marriage. This leads to a lot of the ideas in Mormonism. And it sounds very wholesome on its surface. This idea that families can be together forever. There was a song I learned in primary about that I still have the tune for in my head. don't make the genetic fallacy of assuming that the eternal family's doctrine is wrong because polygamy is wrong. There's a central thread that unites the two that you want to watch out for. Now, polygamy is not the same thing. I just want to restate that polygamy is not the same thing as eternal families. These need to be treated separately, and the concept of celestial marriage needs to be treated separately, even though its expression, its mode, was polygamy at first. There's a difference between polygamy. Again, polygamy is a different issue. It's integral to Mormonism. You can't have Mormonism without polygamy. I've seen some Mormons try to say that, it was just a very dated practice specific to a cultural environment. No, it was not. Brigham Young and many of the apostles at the same time said, polygamy is the only religion that is in heaven. But that is not the same thing in a Latter-day Saint mind from eternal families. So I just let's the reason why I say that, let's have some sympathy. Let's the concept of eternal families itself is intrinsically wholesome. You can find parallels to that in the sense of the communion of the saints in Catholicism. Let's build on that. Don't get so wrapped up in polygamy that you start attacking things that are otherwise, imprudently attacking things that are otherwise held sacred.
Yeah, and I think that I'm trying to think off the top of my head. I don't step into the apologetics world too much myself anymore. I used to spend more time in it, and I'm trying to think of like where I've seen Catholics involved in, engaging with the LDS Church. I know in particular that when it comes to ex-Mormons, not necessarily of any particular persuasion, their approach when it comes to going after the LDS Church, and it makes sense. Like if you turn to Mormon Think, for example,
Right.
I recommend to people as a just wealth of information, but it's okay. It's all up through the end of Joseph Smith's life, because for them, the entire purpose is to sort of kick out the foundation of the LDS Church. They really don't spend a lot of time, I think, on anything beyond just sort of itemizing, like a domino of like Joseph Smith, like you said, with the Book of Abraham or with the Kinderhook plates or with the priesthood, whatever it may be, right? It's just these like individual little things. And I'm trying to think of like how I've seen the Catholics engage that. I know like polygamy seems to be the like go-to one because that's kind of what on a popular surface level that just seems to be what
it's scandalous.
Yeah, it's scandalous, and it's like what people think of, I guess, if you don't know anything else about the Mormons, right? It'd be like one of the like name something about them, that kind of thing.
Right.
So
you made a good point there.
Mhm.
I wrote an essay about it. I'm not going to publish it, but basically, what I write it down, my findings, the way that critics of Mormonism behave. Okay, they do not articulate Mormonism as a paradigm. They attack it as if it were a collection of often disparate doctrines.
Keep talking. I'm going to bring up the causes and costs of Mormons leaving document that you sent me.
Okay, this is something that good to talk about. So, lots of ex-Mormons, including people that become Catholic, will treat Mormonism as just this collection of doctrines, very idiosyncratic. Whether it's the book of Abraham, polygamy, the restrictions on blacks being ordained to the priesthood or participating in certain temple ceremonies, these tend to be the major things. But very often you'll hear Mormons retort that these things can be shed off or shelved. And that's not necessarily true. I understand why they think that, because they think that, oh, well, we'll just put this one thing on the shelf. But you have to see that not as, oh, I have this little trophy here and I have this trophy here and I have this trophy here. I can just throw one away if it's not appealing anymore. It's a machine. Mormonism is a systematic machine, just like any other worldview is. One thing will affect everything else. It'll ripple, reverberate through the entire system. So if you reject polygamy, which comes from the authority of Joseph Smith and Brigham Young, as you say, they were teaching false doctrine, even though there's evidence, there's positive evidence to the contrary, then you're left in a position of cherry picking between doctrines.
I thought this was an interesting.
Let me full screen this. Go ahead and I can see
Yes.
it up close now.
Yeah, so you sent this to me because I had expressed to you that, like I said, it was a rabbit hole for me. I forget how I even ended up, and this was 10 plus years ago. I ended up on these like ex-Mormon forums, and there's an entire like subculture of ex-Mormons. Because another thing I don't necessarily know if Catholics or others appreciate, especially for maybe this might be like a hub where like if especially for those LDS that are in the like Utah area and then spreading out from there. The extent to which a person's life who's raised LDS is wrapped up in the church,
Right.
is much more significant, at least for like the true, what do they call them, the true blood, true believing Mormons or something.
Orthodox.
Yeah, for the very
Orthodox is a little bit of a red herring, but that's probably the best I can give you as a working definition.
Yeah, so like that idea of like let me think, like an average Catholic family, right? If you were to have a child that like falls away from the faith, most Catholics are kind of unfortunate. This isn't unfortunate in some respects. Most
Right.
Catholics are kind of like, well, it's to be blah blah blah, to be expected. Whereas I think for like at least my time that I spent in the ex-Mormon community and world, sort of absorbing some of that experience for them, there was some major like, and I know like deconstructing gets thrown out a lot. And I don't particularly like that, but there was like a major like rug pulled out from the lives of some of these people, because I think of how much it's wrapped up into their lives. And then so for you sent me this. This was just sort of like a survey, and I would love to see actually Catholics do this. That the Mormons did. It looked like it was maybe 2012 when this was released.
Right.
So it might be a little bit dated at this point. I don't know if this is the same reason.
I don't think it's that. It looks pretty consistent.
Yeah.
Anecdotally speaking, these are all the reasons I see people leave still to this day, like my high school peers, which is by the way the most frequent departure from Mormonism. That's when people leave. It's in their 18 years to 22-year-olds. It's about there.
And that makes sense. I mean, that's not actually unlike what you would see with the fall away with Catholics. And it's actually one thing I want to make clear to Catholics that may be watching this, is, again, this was my experience in the ex-Mormon community. It's, take it for what it's worth. But I don't see many of those people like rushing to beat down the doors of your local Catholic church. If anything, there's, from what I've seen anyways, a lot of them seem to reject religion qua religion as they leave out of the church. And I think there was actually a pie graph. Remind me, I'll switch over to that here in a second.
Yeah. Yep.
That expresses that. But these are at least reported in this. Many of the reasons. Were you exposed at all when your way out to the CES letter?
Yes, I thought it was a terrible piece of scholarship. I hated it.
Did you?
Yeah.
Have you reversed that, or you still think it's weak scholarship?
I still think it's awful scholarship. I think all of its conclusions are right. I just think it's awful scholarship, awful philosophy, awful moral thinking. It's just not intelligent.
Yeah, that seems to be like, it's unfortunate in many ways, right? Because as Catholics, obviously we would want to see these people become Catholic, but the like general trend that I saw, and it seems to be the case with the CES letter, I guess I'm sorry, we throw these things out like with the assumption people know what we're talking about, but this was a husband
Jeremy Reynolds,
who turned to his local ward. Would it be?
Maybe
you explain it to me.
CES letter stands for Church Education System. So what he did is he turned to a faculty member, I believe it was at BYU, Provo, for questions about truth claims of the LDS Church. This doesn't necessarily mean they were canonical. This just means that they were things that the church promoted as its narrative. And this was a non-systematic presentation of a litany of so-called issues or historical factors. Okay. And the thing about the way that this letter presents itself, it's very polemical.
Is that it's like the Gish Gallop, right? Where you just
It's a
throw a
gish
bunch.
gallop. It
Yeah.
is classic gish gallop, which Latter-day Saints do all the time, by the way. This is something on all sides. We're all guilty. I
Mhm.
don't. I want to avoid that as much as I can in my own work, but this is something we all do. This work, what its job is to promote suspicion. It is not to provide positive necessities to a contrary rooted in a higher principle. It's just deconstructing. Okay, we'll just break it down into these naturalist, materialist categories and say, oh, so this is probably why it was. Oh, the science says so and so. I can make whatever coherent objections to it from a naturalistic standpoint, and then I can just leave it at that. So here's what happens: most Mormons, because of these issues, whether it's polygamy, Book of Abraham, blacks in the priesthood, they will see this they'll develop this moral antagonism towards leadership in the LDS Church. A lot of the big proponents of this are people like Dr. John Dillon. He's a creator of the Mormon Stories podcast. He wrote this survey, by the way, and when he was still LDS, people will just develop this antagonism. I wouldn't describe it as a hyper rebellious attitude, but there's this profound distrust of religious authority that emerges because of the presence of such a egregious set of falsehoods.
Yeah, and I think that's actually something that I found kind of like I said, it was sort of a rabbit hole, but I found kind of unique is there is a culture of ex-Mormonism that I think you wouldn't find, say, in an ex-Catholic or an
No,
ex-Protestant.
absolutely not.
And so like, yeah, even like looking at a list like this, like these itemized lists of, the anachronisms in the Book of Mormon, the women in the priesthood, like all of these kinds of things. Usually with the Catholics, I've seen a little, I kind of wish we had something like this that we could refer
Yeah,
to for why Catholics leave. But usually, most of your Catholics leave for, if it's not like over sexual, like morality, generally speaking, it may many times I think a lot of Catholics fall away just out of sheer laziness.
yep, that happens. You'll see that. You'll see a pastoral abuse.
Yeah.
That's a common reason. Um, Very, very rarely you'll see an intellectual person with a very, very good argument fall away from religion in general because of their experience.
And then, and I would say now maybe in the world of Reddit, I've stayed away from the Reddit world. So I'm sure there's probably like communities now of like ex-Catholics, like God
Yeah,
forbid, like what spending any time in that community, what that would look like. But this has been a long-standing thing. I remember I was kind of at the end of my road spending time with this over a decade ago. So the ex-LDS, ex-Mormons have been at this for quite a while. And yeah, that was the other thing. I think if I can just kind of see if I can quickly, yeah, this is where they go to. So this is kind of interesting, and this does not surprise me.
right.
So this paragraph is when a Mormon leaves the faith, where we're finding them at afterwards. Uh, Current self-identification of the respondents, right? So 47% go towards agnostic atheist. Um,
Humanist. It's
humanist.
actually more than 50% if you include the bottom part of the graph.
Oh, the atheist and LDS. I got you. Okay.
So it's like culturally
Yeah,
LDS.
that's significant. I mean,
Yeah.
that's a significant number, and that's what I found, and I was kind of like, me as the idealist Catholic that I was like, oh, we're going to have all of these, maybe there's going to be a flood of Mormons into the Catholic Church. And it's like, no, they actually seem to be going in the opposite direction, many of them, and
Mhm.
that's something I think at the very least Catholics should be aware of, in terms of how they're like, especially if you're approaching someone, don't assume if you're approaching someone that you may run across that's an ex-Mormon, that everything that you and I have been talking about tonight, and I know you said you had a friend that was maybe could speak to this,
Yeah. I
and it's a
fondly call him the
complicated.
brother of Jared.
Well, it's a complicated subject because I would just say don't assume that the ex-Mormon that you're speaking to you would approach in the same way as the true believing Mormon that you're speaking to. There's
No.
probably some crossovers and some similarities, but there's been a lot of, depending on who the individual is, there's probably been a lot of deconstruction that's taken place with that person.
Okay, so yes, this is a great place to hover around for a little bit. This is a good, I think it's a good ending note to talk about because it gives us a resolution for how we approach these topics. With Mormons and ex-Mormons, what carries over, what is left behind. Okay, the way I explain this is that I don't want to hover in the modernist the age of the internet. I don't want to hover around in the place where we've been dominated by a lot of atheistic culture. Go back to the first ex-Mormons, Catherine Lewis, the author of the book Wife Number 17. Look at the objections they make. In some things are different. The same aversion to exclusive religious authority persists. Although I do think that you do see a little bit more sophistication early on with systematic critiques, like the kind that I've been promoting. Catherine Lewis, she actually makes the same objection to the disobedience of Adam and Eve on the fall. She comes across as a very pious woman who speaks well of the Catholic Church, by the way. I don't know where she eventually ended up, but the things that carry over, if they reject Mormonism back then, they'll usually retreat to a non-denominational in the 19th century sense. They'll retreat to a non-denominational, nominally Christian background. Okay, as you get into the 1950s, 1970s, 1990s, when a lot of the historical criticisms come out, these things dominate the cultural landscape. So it's like you're up on this ledge, or you're up on this island, and all the things that surround you are either in the 19th century, and that was Christianity generally in America, Protestant Christianity. In the 20th, in the late 20th century, in the 21st century, all of that fallback is now atheism. It's now agnosticism, materialism, naturalism. And here's the thing that I found very interesting. Almost all of the ex-Mormons that I have read, listened to, or talked to carry the same qualities of philosophy that Mormonism holds. Okay, so let me explain what I mean by that. So Mormons are humanists. That chart you say says that agnostic, atheist, humanist. That's a cosmologically and philosophically misinformed position. Mormons are humanists, okay? They're also naturalists. They do not believe in a supernatural supreme reality, okay? Humans are the apex of intelligence and power in the universe in Mormonism. They're also materialists. They believe in eternal matter. They believe that all spirit is just a pure form of matter. Okay, you lose some of those the dogmatic definitions as you become ex-Mormon. A lot of those philosophical presuppositions and a lot of the very dogmatic opinions that people tend to have as ex-Mormons, they'll still have a lot of these same. They'll resort to platitudes. They'll resort to like deconstruction or high demand religion. You'll see a lot of these phrase words just tossed around, and I've met very, very good ex-Mormons, and what I'll find is I'll ask them as a Catholic, okay, what do you mean by high demand religion? And I will explain framing religion in a different way than they were ever exposed to. I'll use more classical, Thomistic or Aristotelian moral structures to help them navigate this. I'll ask them a question, and then we develop a dialogue. Most people that are ex-Mormon are completely clueless about any sort of classical philosophy that leads to things like theism, the moral life, natural law. And what I'm finding that in some cases, they're actually interested in learning more about this intellectually robust engagement with philosophy, with religion. And they think, oh, wow, this is all stuff that I would have thought was reasonable. In fact, it explains some of the reasons why I left Mormonism.
Yeah, and so I think that's... No, go ahead.
I'll give you one example. I think that this is more of a lower level criticism or a more level engagement. I had this one woman, I'll call her Therese. She's an ex-Mormon. She's not Catholic, although I offer my prayers frequently for that to happen one day. I met her in Utah when I was out there on a trip, and I gave her a rosary, and we talked about the rosary and Heavenly Mother Mary and the Queen of Heaven, the ultimate prayer warrior. And she was just so excited about the possibility of having a feminine figure to look up to in her life. She felt like there was a sense that on this local level, something that she had perceived as a disorder before. She's not particularly feminist. She's quite conservative, actually, but she perceived that there was something left out intuitively in Mormonism. But as she's come closer to engaging with a lot of these more traditional forms of Christianity, she's developed that openness. And because I was engaging in this dialogue, not necessarily over dogma, but engaging from the point of natural law, engaging from philosophy, and engaging from the sense of, yes, I validate your concerns. And in fact, your concerns are highly religious concerns. These are not atheistic things that we're talking about together. You have a sense of the objective moral order. You have a sense, in my friend's case, of would God really want a person to be behaving in the way that Joseph Smith was towards women in his time?
Mm-hmm.
Seeing that develop and her thinking through that and blossom, I have very high hopes that there are many people like that who, once they're exposed to this sense of a greater richness, an intellectual richness in Catholicism, and themselves being taken seriously for their concerns over religion and leadership, that will provide an opening for such people to embrace the one holy Catholic and apostolic faith established by Jesus Christ.
Yeah, and I think that's an important thing for Catholics to always keep in the forefront. For those of you that are out there doing in the apologetic field, we have an obligation to not just kick out the pillar that Mormons are standing on and leave them. Right?
Exactly.
You want to find a person. This is, I know people have the criticisms of Francis, but one of his pastoral approaches to evangelization is that you find people where they're at.
Exactly.
And then you lead them to the church from where they're at. And so, having those clear distinctions, right? Am I talking to LDS or am I talking to ex-LDS? And then knowing the difference, and then knowing sometimes, I think it's important too to know that we don't know sometimes, and then maybe the best thing that you can do instead of engaging, because if you're going to go up against, this was the impetus I think for my video about when the Mormons come knocking at your door. If you're going to go up against these people like scripture quote for scripture quote, pound for pound, in some ways those kids are probably going to beat you. Unless you're really up to date on your scriptural knowledge, so then having that more pastoral approach to apologetics, if that is your interest in things, and like I said, I don't think you just want to go and just knock all of these things down, because as the evidence shows, these people are not coming to beat down the door of the Catholic Church, which is your obligation, is to get them in, to bring them into the fold. So I think that's a wonderful approach that you have taken with, you said her name was just
Therese. That is not
okay.
That is not her name. That is the name. I talked with her a lot about Saint Therese of Lisieux.
So that would just be in mind and spirit. Keep this lady in your prayers out there, people,
and many others. There's lots of people that I've been talking to that were in similar situations. So
I think that's a wonderful.
The other people.
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful approach to apologetics, and I actually wish more apologists were like that. Instead of just showing your prowess at how much you can destroy all the little discrepancies about the Book of Abraham, right? Exactly. Actually enter into the world that these people are living in, and then try to, in that Chestertonian way, right? Just try to show them the world outside that you want them to live in. So anyways, Jared, I appreciate it, man. I think it was a good conversation, and I think we covered some territory that you don't necessarily hear on Catholic YouTube so much. I appreciate you taking the time.
I'd be happy to do this again sometime.
Yeah, I think it would be fun to like maybe hone in on some specific areas. We were
Yeah,
very painting with kind of a broad brush tonight, but in the future maybe we can kind of hone in on some specific things.
very much so. Thank you so much, Brian.
Yeah,
God
God
bless you.
bless. God bless you.